we're gonna start the event. My name is Sabin Ningleku. I am a geographer by degree, and I'm a researcher based in social science Baha. I would like to welcome you all to this event. Before I go on to introduce you all, our speaker today, Dr. Gaurav Garg, I would like to spell out a few housekeeping rules, one of which is, I hope you turn your cell phones off. Gaurav will be speaking for 50 minutes or so, and then there will be perhaps a question that I'm going to ask Gaurav to just get the conversation going, and then you may have a little over half an hour towards the end for a Q&A and discussion. That's the way it's going to go today. So, on that note, let's begin this. I truly mean it. It's a pleasure to be introducing you to the audience like this, Gaurav. Gaurav is a historian of cities, mountains, and modern South Asia. His current research focuses on urban capitalism in the global South, the post-war concept of urban crisis, and the history of international development. Gaurav is an assistant professor of history at the Department of History, Ashoka University in India. His first book, from the looks of it, is coming out one of these days, it seems. It's called Agents of Inertia, The Pursuit of Business Interest and Calcutta's Urban Economic Decline, 1900 to 1970. And it will be published by the Cambridge University Press. While he is in the middle of getting this book out, he's also working on another book, the second of his, tentatively titled Foundations of Development. And as if that's not enough, he's putting together some materials for yet another book, which is called The Global History of Indian Mountaineering. Speaking of which, see, I'm not a student of history, and truth be told, I've begun to read Gaurav's work only recently. Having read some of your work and having heard you speak, what I can tell is that some of the stuff that you've written, to me at least, is not only innovative and educational, but also quite path-breaking. So speaking of your work on mountaineering, for example, there's 2 or 3 very critical questions you raise about, how this idea of beauty came to be synonymous with mountains when we look at the mountains. Is it something that we are naturally dispositioned towards since our birth, or is it something that is culturally trained by factor outside of our control over the course of our life at some point down the history? Likewise, he also poses similar questions about mountaineering. It is a commonsensical knowledge that mountaineering as a form of sport, this idea of conquest as we know it, is imported from the West, is the commonsensical knowledge. But Gaurav asks very pertinent questions and makes really intriguing claims about how at some point in history the Indians and Chinese may have been complicit in the making of mountaineering as we know in the global South. So to know more, you would have to read his work, and I will have to also shut up. But yeah, on that note, this talk is titled Development Insights for Kathmandu, and inside brackets, and others from the world's worst city, inside quotation marks. Now, I wanted to tell Gaurav that if you had to pick a time and a place, there would be no better time and no worse place than Kathmandu in here now to give a talk on a title such as this, where if you look at it from the vantage point or the location of the urban poor, we may be living in a city that's vying to be the world's worst city without the quotation mark. So on that note, over to you and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabine, for this very, very generous introduction. I'm really grateful to you. I would like to begin also by thanking the Social Science Baha and Deepak Thapa for organizing this talk. It really means a lot to me to be able to give a public lecture in this wonderful city and in this really beautiful venue. And also a special thanks to colleagues, and if I may, now friends at Martin Chautari for their warmth and collegiality, and for giving me an opportunity to spend a few weeks in Kathmandu, not as a tourist, but as a scholar, which I now know is the best way to experience Kathmandu. And of course, thank you to all of you for taking out time to attend this talk today. I really appreciate it. I think it will be fair for me to begin by apologizing for this rather pompous title today. The first apology is I just realized there's a typographical error in the title. The quote does not end. But the second apology is because there are two cities that I really love in this world. One is Calcutta, my home, and the other Kathmandu, which has been extraordinarily kind to me ever since I first visited in the winter of 2010. The title of this talk does a disservice, in my view, to both. It calls my city, Calcutta, the world's worst, and it probably conveys the impression that I am here to lecture the citizens, residents, and intellectuals of Kathmandu on Kathmandu. Neither is true. What I really wanted to convey through this inadequate title is that this talk will attempt to reflect and think with you on what cities of the global south, and in particular, what cities of South Asia may learn from each other. And since I'm constrained by the accidents of my birth and scholarship to view all cities of the world through the lens of Calcutta, there is no other frame of reference I can bring to bear for seeing Kathmandu as well. In this regard, I can do no better than Italo Calvino's wonderful passage in his collection of poems, Invisible Cities. In one of the many fascinating imaginary conversations between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan, Calvino writes the following. Dawn had broken when he said, "Sire, now I have told you all that I know about cities. There is still one of which you never speak." This is Kublai. Marco Polo bowed his head. "Venice," the Khan said. Marco smiled. "What else do you believe I have been talking to you about?" The emperor did not turn a hair and said, "And yet, I have never heard you mention that name." And Polo said, "Every time I describe a city, I'm saying something about Venice. When I ask you about other cities," Kublai insisted, "I want to hear about them, and about Venice when I ask you about Venice." And then Marco replies, "To distinguish other cities' qualities, I must speak of a first city that remains implicit. For me, it is Venice." So for Marco, that is Venice, and for me, that implicit city is Calcutta. So on that note, what I'm going to do today is talk about Calcutta's emergence as the world's worst city in Western imagination and planning and in media circles in the 1960s, and simultaneously reflect on what Calcutta's 20th century development experience may have to offer for Kathmandu. Much of what I have to say, sorry for the advertising pitch, is going to appear in my forthcoming book, Agents of Inertia. The subtitle keeps changing. And it has appeared in my article, The World's Worst City, in the Journal of Global History. It's an open source article, so you can access it. However, that said, the attempt in this talk to think about aspects of Kathmandu's own tryst with urban planning and development from the 1960s is new, and I hope that in this talk marks the beginning of a more intensive scholarly engagement with the past, present, and future of this incredible city, which has also had a very rich history of connections with my city, Calcutta. Now, Calcutta is the cradle of Indian modernity. Throughout the colonial and early post-colonial era, it was the country's premier cultural and educational center. It was also, without a doubt, one of the two most important business centers alongside Bombay, specializing in jute, coal, engineering, tea exports, and all sorts of financial and commercial services. Immediately after 47, when India got independence, If Delhi was crowned India's political capital and Bombay as its financial capital, Calcutta became the country's industrial and cultural capital. However, from the late 1950s, this city began to acquire a dubious global reputation as the world's worst city. For Western planners and media, and eventually Indian politicians too, as I will show, this city came to embody the world's most sinister urban crisis. Now, there are two elements to Calcutta's crisis, one material and the other discursive, because obviously there is no smoke without fire. The material conditions of the crisis can be partly attributed to the series of shocks that confronted Calcutta from the early 1940s. This turbulent and painful decade for Calcutta started with the Great Bengal Famine, which killed 3 million people. By this time, Calcutta became the center of Allied operations in the entire Eastern Front during World War II, which disrupted its economy. The middle part of the decade saw communal violence leading to Bengal's partition, and the end of the decade saw a massive refugee crisis. So by the early 1950s, there was a sense that the city is struggling. So for example, local newspapers would have cartoons such as these. In here, the person standing on the tree is a resident of Calcutta. The tiger represents housing shortage, and the shark in the water represents cholera. So it's just giving you a sense that there was now an emerging idea that something is up with the city. But what really made Calcutta so incapable of handling the pressures that confronted it in the 1940s, I argue in my book, was a deliberate long-term underinvestment in urban improvement and infrastructure stretching back to at least the 1890s. This deliberate underinvestment was enforced, I show, mainly by its British and Indian business elites. From the late 19th century onwards, Calcutta's British and Indian businesses used their influence in city and provincial government to ally with landed interests to scuttle virtually every infrastructural project in the city. Examples would include an ambitious scheme to connect Calcutta to its eastern hinterlands via a safer, shorter canal route. Examples also include the iconic Howrah Bridge, which is the symbol of Calcutta. They wanted to continue with this old floating bridge, which was already in a state of disrepair by the 1920s. They in fact delayed the construction of this bridge by at least 20 years. And they also tried to scuttle and did not show any interest in an unprecedented Ford Foundation-led World Bank-backed urban renewal program for Calcutta in the 1960s. Calcutta's business elites, allied with landed elites, also pushed down local taxation to the lowest possible levels. Until the 1960s, Calcutta was the lowest taxed city in India. It had the lowest urban property rates, and it was the only city to not impose octroi, that is, taxes on goods and vehicles entering the city. So you can see from these figures is that at least by the early 1960s, per capita taxation in Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi, Calcutta was taxing, the Calcutta elites were paying around only 1/3 of taxes generally of Bombay. Consequently, the city also experienced a sharp decline in per capita expenditure on urban improvements. CIT is Improvement Trust and CC is Calcutta Corporation. But what you have is the levels of 1921 are not reached until early 1960s. So you see a continuous decline in per capita investments in urban improvements as well. In other words, for the first 7 decades of the 20th century, a time of tectonic changes world over, including in Nepal, Calcutta's business and landed elites succeeded in sustaining a status quoist, low tax, low expenditure urban regime. Now one can argue that given the nature of the investments, landed elites do resist large-scale urban transformations for fear of devaluations of their landed assets and other inconveniences. But the same is seldom true for businesses. In capital cities world over, from New York to Calcutta's rival Bombay, businesses have historically operated as agents of creative destruction. The challenge for urban planning, challenge for government has often been to contain the reckless speculative energies of the private sector as it seeks to transform and dismantle the cities in which they operate. However, Calcutta's businesses did not behave that way. I cannot go into much detail as to why they did what they did, but to put it briefly, I argue that businesses operated as agents of inertia because it was in their interest. Their interest was shaped by conjunction of three factors. First, it was peculiarly difficult to financialize urban land in Calcutta. The mortgage and debenture markets were very weak. Secondly, Calcutta was a hyper-primate city which specialized in monopoly products. In other words, it did not have to compete with any other ports or any other cities to maintain its primacy. It could simply prevent other ports and cities from emerging. So a good example is when Bengal was being partitioned in the early 20th century, the first partition of Bengal, the British businesses in the Bengal Chamber of Commerce went to the Viceroy, who was the main executive of the empire, and basically said, we will support the partition only if you ensure that nothing is done to favor the port at Chittagong over the port in Calcutta. This kind of strategy continued even beyond 1947. Calcutta's land finance disarticulation and hyper-primacy also helped sustain a socio-racial distinction between the city's elites. As the most dominant landed group, the Bengalis could not enter into businesses, and the most dominant business group, the British, did not enter into real estate because it was not in their interest to do so. Despite unyielding racial tensions, British businesses and Bengali landlords, in their interest, combined to ensure that no other group that could combine commercial and landed interests could have any say or any power in urban politics. As a result, Marwari, Jewish, and Armenian merchants were rendered insignificant in urban politics. In other words, the city's dominant groups ensured that, unlike Bombay, Calcutta did not have to contend with a group like Parsis that could combine land with commerce. The result was that Calcutta's elite locked their cities into what I call a deep freeze. Consider the following statement made by the Public Works Minister, the PWD Minister of the Government of West Bengal in 1975. He wrote, "The word reconstruction has a connotation which is perhaps not strictly applicable to Calcutta. This is not a cliche but a fact. Unfortunately, there has been very little construction in Calcutta during the present century unless one takes into account buildings that have come up. It may be news to many, and he's writing this in 1975, that the last waterworks were built in the city in 1896, the last major sewer network laid around 1906, and the last major road built in the 1930s. And all this while, for those who are familiar with South Asian history, the city's elites, business groups, and landed groups were the ones that called the shot in city government. India had not transitioned to mass democratic politics. Also by this time, Calcutta's population density increased from 26,000 people per square mile in 1921 to around 74,000 people per square mile, making it the most densely packed city in the world. Obviously, over time, any economically and demographically exploding city which does not or cannot grow infrastructurally will suffer consequences. For Calcutta, these consequences, as I'll show, were quite tragic. But before proceeding, there's a question that needs to be answered. Why is it that businesses got away with this kind of anti-development behavior? One argument could be that the state was weak and weak enough to discipline the city's elites. But I argue that the issue is different. The issue is actually deeply conceptual and deeply ideological. The problem was this. In colonial and early post-colonial India, the state and development experts invariably believed that business interest was the same as public interest. I consider the assumption of unity of business interest and public interest to be a part of a larger repertoire of what James Scott has called strategies of state simplification. And I call it, for reasons that I cannot go into want of time, utilitarian developmentalism, because the sources of inspiration was not Adam Smith, who famously argued that the interest of the business is opposed to the interest of the society, but the interest came from liberal utilitarian thinkers like David Ricardo and James Mill. Utilitarian developmentalism, as it played out in India, had three features. Business interest and public interests were aligned, number one. The interest of landed elites was against the public interest. And the opinion of India's poor did not matter, as they only followed their leaders, who were usually landed elites. This gave businesses tremendous power in shaping policy and infrastructure. The result was that even when businesses scuttled programs that were designed in their interest, the government could not grasp what they were up to. It kept thinking that business response to particular projects was an aberration, a one-off event. If only these projects could be planned better, if only businesses could be given a better deal, if only they could be given a better institutional setting, if only they could be given a better say, they would offer their support. Now, in the colonial and early colonial period, utilitarian developmentalism, to be sure, had a deductive logic. So in other words, the state assumed that businesses would follow and act on public interest. So if the state felt a bridge was in public interest, it also assumed that that would be in the interest of business, as it would help expand market and reduce the time in which goods circulate and flow in the economy. This kind of thinking, of course, is not very different from Fordism in the United States in the early 20th century, when the idea was that if white workers are better paid and better paid enough to be able to afford a car, it is in the interest of the Ford Motor Company to actually let that happen so that they become customers of the same company in which they work. Now, for a brief period in the 1970s, this logic of utilitarian developmentalism suffered an eclipse. But then it rode back in the 1980s with a twist. What was once a deductive logic became an inductive logic. If previously the idea was that if a bridge is in public interest, businesses would support it, now the idea was that if businesses want a bridge or a canal or a road, the public should support it because it is in their interest. In other words, the difference between the two iterations of utilitarian developmentalism may appear to be trivial, but they're actually very significant. If previously businesses chose from a bouquet of policy options and infrastructural options that the state provided, in neoliberal India, it is a reverse. It is now the government that is expected to choose from a range of options defined by businesses. And this has become a really hegemonic idea. Consider the kind of celebration, consider the way India celebrated the wedding of the son of India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. Right? So the idea is, if they are doing well, we will also do well. So there's been an interesting flip there. And this is the kind of logic that often blinds the state and the public from making sense of business interest in the concrete. Now this brings me to the first set of insights that I have to offer. The first is, cities all over the world bend over backwards to attract capital. I know that Kathmandu now hopes to become, for example, a major data and major IT center. If Calcutta's forgotten experience is anything to go by, however, simply embedding big capital in the city may not promote its urban well-being. Businesses and their investments, once entrenched, as Calcutta shows, can also very well become central obstacles to urban development and change. What interests businesses will pursue over time and how the pursuit of those interests will translate into urban matters in cities like Kathmandu and Calcutta cannot be predetermined. The second, and this speaks to a question that Sabine asked in one of his wonderful articles on Sukumbasis. Sabine asked, what is it about urban environment that selectively allows only elites and middle classes to make claims on public interest? If Calcutta's experience is anything to go by, it would seem to me that the answer to that question lies in the idea that the interest of business elites and the interest of public is aligned, that businesses do better necessarily in a more prosperous society. This is something Adam Smith had vehemently argued against, and it has been neatly forgotten. In other words, the unity of interest doctrine is baked very deep into the very idea of what we consider to be development. The issue is conceptual and ideological, and for those who are committed to breaking the stranglehold of elitism in the shaping of our world, I think it is also incumbent to rethink, for them to radically think of a different idea than development itself. The third point It is not uncommon for scholars and activists concerned with cities to raise alarm about real estate markets in which land is rapidly commodified and financialized thanks to the nexus between politics, banks, and businesses. Such investments lock up capital in less productive uses, make financial sector vulnerable to collapse, make housing unaffordable, and often promote urban sprawl. All this is true. But the Calcutta example also shows what can happen in an environment where this kind of capitalist real estate market is stymied. What I think is that, with the exception of cities like that have an overabundance of capital, like Abu Dhabi or Doha, which have fossil fuel, or with the exception of cities that are not saddled with the task of promoting accumulation for accumulation's sake, a city like Vienna maybe. Capital cities like Kathmandu and Calcutta that also serve as centers and engines of economic growth are destined to lurch between two extremes. One extreme is sprawl and real estate frenzy. The other extreme is precipice of stasis, inertia and stasis, what we see in Calcutta. Urban planning often is just about getting the balance right between these two extremes. It is about walking on a knife edge, but unfortunately there is no way to get there except perhaps by never-ending and extremely painful trial and error. Now, to return to my Calcutta story, just because the city was in a deep construction freeze at a time of population explosion and economic growth should not have necessarily meant that Calcutta went on to acquire such a bad urban reputation. In fact, those very signs of congestion, poverty, homelessness could also be interpreted as a city's sign of success. Look at India's Bangalore today. The argument is that the city is attracting more capital and people than it can handle. And in many Western and Indian accounts of the early 1950s on Calcutta, this kind of discourse was not uncommon. But three things happened in 1955, in that specific year 1955, which changed Calcutta's reputation forever. The first, a very interesting and novel concept appeared in the United States called urban crisis. Prior to this, there was no such concept. Experts, scholars, and policymakers believed that poverty, pollution, homelessness were all disaggregated issues that were simply seen in cities in a more concentrated form. But around this time, in the United States, urban crisis appeared as a unifying concept which suggested that issues that plague cities are interconnected, common, and uniquely urban. The context of the emergence of this idea in the United States, of course, was a flight of white population to the suburbs, what is called white flight to the suburbs, and the in-migration of rural black population to the city core. But with all things American in the 1950s, this concept aspired to dominate the world. Urban crisis therefore soon escaped the confines of its specific contexts and made Calcutta its first pit stop. Why did it do so? There are two things happened in 1955. One, as probably is well known, India became a frontline state in economic Cold War as both the US and the USSR, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, started to vie with each other to win the hearts and minds of the people of the Third World. And in this contest between peoples to win the heart and mind of the people of the Third World, India, which was a non-aligned country, was very much central. And secondly, and probably far more importantly, in the winter of 1955, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev and Premier Bulagnin made a landmark trip to Asia. But it was their visit to Calcutta that proved to be the most dramatic. 2 million people lined the streets to greet the Soviet leaders. At one point, the crowd tried to garland the leaders, so when they were traveling in their open-air car, because of the crush of people, the car broke down, and then Khrushchev and Bulagnin had to be dragged into a police van and driven across the back alleys of Calcutta to Raj Bhavan, where they were due to stay. The crowds, however, continued to throng the streets through day and night, and the city was effectively shut down as long as the Soviet leaders were there. The reception that they received was so overwhelming that the next day, India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had to make a statement publicly declaring that India will stay neutral. It was not going the Soviet way. So these are some photos from his of that visit, but I'll show you a short video to give you a sense of this visit. I'll take 3 minutes of your time, but I think it's very interesting. Can I? Yeah. This video is a lot of fun. I really want to show. Okay.
As Mr. Bulganian and Mr. Khrushchev alight from the plane, they are received by the Chief Minister of West Bengal, Dr. The people of Calcutta wait eagerly at Dum Dum Airport to greet the Soviet leaders now touring our country. As Mr. Bulganian and Mr. Khrushchev alight from the plane, they are received by the Chief Minister of West Bengal, Dr. Roy.
So this is the open-air car in which they are going.
The two leaders wave to the crowd as they leave for their 9-mile drive to Patan. Every conceivable point of vantage on balcony, window or rooftop is occupied along the entire route. Unprecedented scenes of enthusiasm are witnessed throughout the long drive to Rajbhavan. Doves, symbolizing peace, flutter over the decorated streets. The whole of Calcutta seems to have emptied itself to the streets to join in the biggest ovation ever recorded in the city's living memory. The entire route to Rajbhavan is one enthusiastic mass of humanity. Halfway through their drive, the Soviet leaders have to change into the nearest wireless van as their car breaks down due to the huge crowds making normal progress impossible. Not only the citizens of Calcutta, but people from far and near have come in their thousands to join in the greetings to the Soviet leaders. Villagers have come from all parts of West Bengal. Some have also come from the Lalitpur district of Bihar, and others from as far away as Orissa. As the convoy slowly makes its way towards Patan, crowds are disappointed at not getting a glimpse of Mr. Bulganian and Mr. Khrushchev, who are seated in the closed van. But their happy mood of welcome does not abate.
Right. So this is the Soviet version. The commentary was a Soviet version. It's from the Russian embassy has uploaded it on YouTube. You can watch it. The American version went like this. Analyzing the reasons behind the Soviet success in Calcutta, A.M. Rosenthal, who was then the special correspondent of India and later went on to win the Pulitzer and also became the executive director of New York Times, wrote that Queen Elizabeth or President Eisenhower might have received a warm welcome in other Indian cities but not in Calcutta. This was alarming because Calcutta was not only India's largest city but also more vital and representative of India than New Delhi. Mirroring George Kennan's influential observation that communism is a disease that grows on dead tissue, Rosenthal argued if there were more red flags flying in Calcutta than in Moscow, it was because Calcutta was India's most economically degraded city. The continuation of European racial privileges, combined with millions of unaccounted immigrants with little economic stake in the city, had made it a happy hunting ground for communism. On cue, international news reports henceforth began to describe Calcutta as restless, turbulent, and volatile. And just trying to get the. Can you please help me here? Yeah, got it. But the view. Can you change the view, please? Sorry, this toggling it takes the time it takes. All right, yeah, thanks. So this was reception. So international news henceforth began to describe Calcutta as restless, turbulent, and volatile. One of the most striking examples of post-1955 discourse on Calcutta can be seen in how Time magazine reported the city's 1958 cholera outbreak, another gift of elite indifference to Calcutta. While the magazine had previously blamed cholera outbreaks in Calcutta, which was almost an annual feature, on the poor sense of hygiene of Indians, by 1958, this cholera outbreak provided an astonishing diatribe on the city. It described Calcutta as a packed and pestilent town, impossibly crowded, hopelessly poor, and as an assault on the senses. It said, Calcutta shocks the eye with its swarming beggars and starved mothers feeding their baby. It stings the nose with mingled odors of garbage, curry, roasted onions, rancid mustard oil, and human sweat. And it assaults the ear with the cry of hawkers, shrieks of cartwheels, and incessant din of horns surrounded by bearded Sikh cab drivers who hurtle past in ancient taxis as if pursued by many-handed Kalis herself. Calcutta was suffocating under the weight of its own people, and to make things worse, it was providing communists the base to build, which is why when Khrushchev and Bulagnin visited Calcutta, the red apparatus could fill the streets with 2 million screaming enthusiasts. So we see how rapidly the discourse changes on the city. It is in this context that World Bank appeared on the scene. The bank played a central and perhaps the most important role in making the city an object of transnational concern. In 1960, the bank appointed a 3-member team of economists led by Michael Hoffman to assess India's third 5-year plan. Hoffman's final report, which broadly endorsed India's heavy industry-led planning, however, singled out Calcutta for special treatment. It noted, one of the most dangerous weaknesses of the plan was continued neglect of the problems of urban development in Calcutta. Overcrowding, degradation of housing, health hazard, primitive water supplies, lack of space for new industries, traffic bottlenecks, power shortage, unresolved refugee problem was putting impediments in the way of India's most rapidly expanding industrial region. It warned also that the city's condition nurtured feelings of unrest and malaise in the population, which are likely to boil over from time to time in ways that are both destructive and inimical to orderly economic development. So it stressed something had to be done, and it also hinted that foreign aid might be available if Calcutta could start a planning program. So the lure of aid and the fear of electoral reversal amongst Indian politicians, and of course the fear of rise of communism, soon meant that Indian politicians and economic planners, who like their counterparts world over at the time, neither thought of cities as development problems nor as engines of economic growth, entered the crisis bandwagon. And soon the Ford Foundation, which I've argued elsewhere, shared a very special relationship with India, which also began around 1955, joined in. By 1961, therefore, a transnational coalition involving Ford, World Bank, Government of West Bengal, and Government of India was formed that set out transforming Calcutta. It's another story that they tried to ally with Calcutta's business community, but they were not interested. However, this was a landmark initiative. Until this time, international development agencies' economic planners harbored an anti-urban bias. Experts globally believed that major development initiatives in existing cities of the global south would only reinforce their pre-existing infrastructural and economic advantages over rural areas. This would result in an increase in migration from rural areas to urban areas until the marginal benefit of new improvements are consumed. This is why development schemes in the 1950s globally was almost always focused on rural areas. Large or existing cities of the developing world were not considered to be problems. The newly independent countries of the development world, insofar as they were interested in cities, built new capital on new industrial cities. They did not focus on existing cities. But the crisis of Calcutta, I argue, and I've shown here, unsettled this idea forever. And thus was born something that we call urban development. On cue, urban planners moved in to cash in on the opportunity. Urban planning firms of international repute, for example, like the Doxiadis Associates who built Islamabad, tried to get an entry into Calcutta program by projecting themselves as the most suitable for dealing with a city that faces the worst condition in the world and the most difficult urban problems ever encountered. A Pittsburgh-placed urban planner wrote that Calcutta was a Ford-sent opportunity to expand and deepen the profession of urban planning. Now, once the coalition started to work to prepare a plan, it became important for them to justify their involvement in a project as complex and expensive as Calcutta. And part of that involvement meant that they ensured that the city's crisis remained in the news. Reports appeared consistently in American and Indian media which described Calcutta's awesome crisis. To give an example, in 1967, the Ford Foundation assembled a team of urbanists, and they came out with the following statement, which was splashed all across global media. They said, "We have not seen human degradation on a comparative scale anywhere in the world. This is a matter of one of the greatest urban concentrations in existence, rapidly approaching the point of breakdown in terms of its economy, housing, sanitation, transport, and essential humanities of life. If the final breakdown were to take place, it would be a disaster for mankind of a more sinister sort than any disaster of flood or famine. It would be a confession of failure at the first major confrontation of mankind's ability to organize vast, rapidly growing urban concentrations into which humanity seems inevitably destined to move." To give another example, in 1968, the New York Times published an op-ed titled "A Sinister Urban Crisis," which stated that of all the beleaguered urban centers of the world, Calcutta is the most wretched, most desperate, and most crucial in terms of broad national and international interests it might affect. This op-ed was written by another future Pulitzer Prize winner, journalist, and future executive editor of New York Times, Joseph Lelyveld. But it was a result of a discussion between Ford officials in Calcutta, Indian government officials, and Lelyveld himself. Ford planners like Colin Rosser were particularly pleased that this editorial has attracted so much attention in the United States, judging by the letters we have received on the matter. Later in the year, Lelyveld also wrote that Calcutta was not one disaster but many. It was the world's worst city. And then something else happened, what I call an accident of history. We all know that in 1955, Khrushchev was forced to abandon his car and was taken in police van to the Raj Bhavan. In 1968, another important world dignitary was to make the same journey. He was Robert McNamara. He too would be forced to abandon his car, but this time not due to adoring crowds. Instead, he was met with fierce anti-Vietnam War protests who blocked all exit routes from the Calcutta airport. McNamara had to be airlifted from the airport to the Raj Bhavan, the same place where Khrushchev was once taken in a police van. The New York Times bristled at the rude reception that Calcutta gave to McNamara and proclaimed in an editorial that Calcutta was a heart of enemy territory, epitome of worldwide problems of hunger, poverty, and want. The violence that the World Bank head has encountered was commonplace in the world's most miserable city. The same year, the Australian Financial Review called Calcutta the world's problem city. British journalist Geoffrey Moorhouse wrote a book which made Calcutta Way a shorthand for urban crisis and despair. And the French documentary filmmaker Louis Malle shot his documentary Calcutta. The screening of this documentary in Britain angered the Indian government so much that it threw out the BBC from India for a year. Even Fidel Castro aired this documentary in Cuba to deflect attention from his economic problems. And Indian diplomats could be found scurrying across the world in cities like Barcelona, Vienna, Berlin, and Buenos Aires, requesting local authorities to not screen the film, but in vain. Soon, Calcutta began to stand in for urban crisis globally. It was now enough to call Naples the Calcutta of Europe. Parts of Naples are still called Calcutta of Europe. It was enough Cairo and Johannesburg felt that they might become Calcutta of Africa. And even war-torn Saigon in the middle of the Vietnam War felt that it had become reminiscent of Calcutta. Even for Bombay, and I really don't like this, even for Bombay in the early 1970s, the main anxiety was whether it was doomed to become another Calcutta. So Calcutta in this way became, as a UN General Secretary in 1969 said, the world crisis came to embody world crisis in urbanization. The impact of this reputation was threefold. One, it brought urban development and international aid and attention to Calcutta. It is said if St. Teresa of Calcutta did not exist, we would have had to create one. Second, the same reputation, however, caused a serious image problem which persisted long after the issues that produced crisis talk had abated. Even in the 1980s and even today, Calcutta's businesses often complain about the city's image problem as being a key factor in preventing its economic revival. The third, and I think this is important, Calcutta came to be imagined or conceptualized as an organism. Implicit in the view that Calcutta was a crisis city is the idea that cities are like organisms, they have a life cycle. Calcutta became the awful example to frighten governments and municipal authorities that cities could die. Media and urban planners began projecting Calcutta as the ultimate image of a megapolis in decay and in despair, a city postponing the day of reckoning by the skin of its teeth. Calcutta was thus considered behind Western cities. At times the word used was stunted, at times retarded. It was considered to be underdeveloped and behind Western cities, but also ahead in the sense it was the first one to confront the struggle between life and death. It is in this context that Kathmandu's 1969 urban plan, the first urban plan for Calcutta, was produced. Urban development has happened, physical planning is happening, urban planning as a profession has become respectful. And much like the plan produced for Calcutta, it was a comprehensive regional plan. However, while planners saw Calcutta as a city on the brink of death, they viewed Kathmandu as a unique city. Just like activists like Hutaram Bediaji, who conceptualized Kathmandu as Bagmati civilization, planners of the 1960s saw Kathmandu as a highly evolved urban civilization for many centuries, which was nevertheless pre-industrial in nature and would remain so in the future. The idea of pre-industrial Kathmandu Valley, locked perpetually in pre-industrialism, was predicated on the two ways in which the valley and by extension Nepal was seen in the 1960s. One, as Western tourists would have it, Kathmandu came to be seen as a last home of hope, or last home of mystery, almost like Shangri-La. Second, as development experts, especially associated with Ford Foundation, would often say, it was the capital of a medieval country which had overnight assumed many features of a modern state without the capacity to sustain it. These twin features meant that unlike the city's elites of the 1960s, for whom things like, as Mark Leckie has put it, mountains, temples, festivals, and rustic lifestyles were the very obstacles that stood between them and modernity, for Western planners like Karl Prussia, it was these features that needed to be preserved. This is very clearly visible in the remarkably non-modernist 1969 plan, which paid special attention to the valley's architecture, traditional core, festivals, and its agrarian heartlands. Written in the high noon of modernization, it's a remarkably non-modernist document. It is an unrecognized exception in the history of global planning. Plans are often criticized for being disconnected with reality, but I think the issue with this one was that it was disconnected with the aspirations of Kathmandu's elites. And this brings me to the next set of insights. Urban development is the offspring of urban crisis and not a subset of development. To convince policymakers to think about urban development, planners and media had to create an urban crisis. Perhaps this is why, while the idea of urban crisis often evokes the poor, the marginalized, and the homeless, the solution to that crisis, urban development rarely does. Urban development often becomes Garib Hatao rather than Garibi Hatao. The second insight is that how planners and policymakers conceptualize and project cities is of vital importance. This is important. These conceptualizations are often anthropomorphic. They say cities like organism. Examples: New York is a city that never sleeps. The other day I read in the Indian Express that Chandigarh is choking is on ventilator. An opinion piece in Nepali Times in 2003 once proclaimed that Kathmandu has a malignant tumor, by which it meant squatters. Cities therefore have lungs like green patches, kidneys like wetlands, heart like business core, and they can also have diseases that require surgery or medicine for the organism to survive. The idea of civilization too, the terms in which Kathmandu has been conceived very often, is one kind of anthropomorphic thinking. Notice how civilizations are born, they rise, they decline, they fall, they die. Civilizations can be young and old. If you're Samuel Huntington, they always clash, they compete, and like students in a classroom, they can be ranked. And they have a personality which is often defined by religion or region or nature. Civilization, in other words, is like an organism. It has an agency and a life cycle. The important point here is that underlying any organism-like imagination lie ideas of purity, pollution, circulation, belonging. The survival of an organism, after all, lies in its ability to belong or adapt to its environment, identify and isolate pollutants or impurities and excrete them out, expel them, and to keep blood circulating without obstruction. We can see this in recent changes in Kathmandu as well. The drive to remove eyesores like slums, polluting elements like sukumbasis, obstructions like hawkers that allegedly hinder circulation, and issues such as who belongs to the valley, I think stem from this common but dangerous conceptions of cities world over. My plea is that in addition to rethinking development, urban development, to escape the clutches of elitism, we also need a non-organismic imagination of the city to make our cities more inclusive. By means of conclusion, I would make one last point in brief. The failures of urban planning in the 1960s and 70s in Calcutta, Kathmandu, and elsewhere should have resulted in an urban planning or development planning emergency. But it did not. And here, Calcutta played a role, this time by not dying. Contrary to all expectations in the 1970s, Calcutta did not die. And that city did not die produced two tendencies in urban circles. One believed that cities could muddle through with incredibly low levels of infrastructure and civic services. This was prevalent in global liberal development circles and made them complacent about the fate of cities. The urgency that marked their intervention in urban affairs in the 1960s started to dissipate. The second one was that cities are essentially self-correcting. They do not die, but they contract and expand in order to survive. Indeed, from the 1970s, Calcutta's population growth abated, economic activity became more or less stalled. It declined as a business center as well. All this led policymakers, especially from the American New Right, to believe that through triage and benign neglect, cities could be managed via market forces. It is in this context that US President Gerald Ford famously called the New York City government's bluff when it declared bankruptcy and asked it to drop dead. Ford knew that New York could not drop dead. Instead, New York City, which had the most expansive welfare government for any city in the US at the time, got taken over by Wall Street. And since then, we have seen the birth of neoliberal urbanism marked by retreat of the state and a forefronting of markets and big business. No wonder then, and I went to the Social Science Baha Library on Monday to look at urban documents for Kathmandu in the 1990s, and taken together, they made some seriously interesting points. Here they are. Hang on. Yeah. One point was, and this is a combination of two documents, it said urban growth is a market-oriented process. The second, it said, it is impossible for government to reshape settlement patterns at a national level, and it is expensive to try. Explicit spatial policies are marginal in comparison to the working of the markets. Government should rather support development opportunities already taking place, locations where growth is rapid and deficits already considerable, through provisioning of supporting infrastructure. At the same time, it said, people have a right to develop land, but they do not have a right to infrastructure, by which they meant water, electricity, sewage, drains. So I hope, I'm still trying to chew and think about the significance of these three principles, but I hope that my presentation has shown the contingent, torturous, and accidental ways our cities have reached a point where profits and markets are more important than people. This was not inevitable. This is a product of history. Many thanks. Thank you.
My goodness, Gaurav, if only, economists, including our current finance minister, spoke of economics in the same way you as a historian speak of history, it would be quite something else. But we have we have 25 minutes. I will take less than 2 minutes to pose one or two questions out of curiosity. I had more, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pick just one or two. In all my time in my grad studies, having gone through literatures on global South urbanism of different subfields, I haven't, upon my return, I haven't read much. I should be very honest, in the last 3-4 years. But in all this time as a grad student, I don't think I've come across a material such as this that pushes us and provokes us to look at the urban question, particularly in the global South, in a new light, right? So here's a question for you, again, out of curiosity. What is it about this idea of, so your mission was to kind of interrogate this idea of crisis, particularly as it was, thrown at Calcutta, initially from the West, and later inhabited by, the chief minister himself. So, what were some of the triggers that really pushed you to make an inquiry as crucial and as critical as this? Is my very honest curiosity as a researcher, right? The historians may not be as curious as I am now, but that's my curiosity. Also, I think, speaking of the field of urban planning, because we understand history also as being contingent, right? Where is this narrative that you put together located when we think of history as a matter of contingency rather than as an outcome of grand design? That's one. The other is to wear the geographer's hat and to locate your mode of inquiry, or to kind of frame your mode of inquiry through the politics of scale. A lot of this is placed scalarly, in the sense that it is placed at the global scale, right? You have the Ford Foundation, you have the World Bank, you have the American aid. It is located at the national scale, and it is also located at the scale of the state, right? So Mr. Roy, submitting himself to the idea of crisis. But my question to you is, if you were to locate this inquiry, this idea of crisis, because it is not just discursive and conceptual, these are also, lived materially as a matter of ritual, day in, day out, by different, communities and groups of people in the city. So if you were to look at this inquiry, this frame of crisis that you're deploying, at the scale of the everyday, particularly of those who are culturally disenfranchised and materially deprived, what do you think this frame of crisis would look like in the context of Calcutta? You can choose to avoid this last question. It may be outside the confines of your inquiry. It probably is, because I can hear myself talk. But those are my questions, and then the floor will be open for you all to dive in. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabine, for your very generous comments and for your really, really excellent questions. I'll try to keep my answers brief so that we can take more. So I think, so the trigger for this particular research was that I didn't know Calcutta had this reputation. As a resident of the city, I was not aware of this reputation. But I did know, because if you live in Calcutta, you live mentally in 19th century. Because that is when the city was everything. It was India's everything. There was no other city that was worth talking about. So if you're a resident of the city, mentally 19th century was a great time, and then 20th century has been one long running disaster. So I wanted to actually understand not two things. I wanted to understand the material basis of this representation, because there's no smoke without fire. But I also wanted to understand the discursive basis. How did the city come to acquire the reputation it did? And the standard stories I got was, the left sweeps to power in 1977 and then all hell break loose. Given the places where I've studied, it was not palatable. So I wanted to interrogate that a bit further. And then that brought me into the throes of Cold War politics and the elite of business behavior. So I think the trigger went in that way. So I think in terms of when we think of, in terms of, history of course is one of contingency, and the question was where would I locate it in the history of urban planning, right? So I think the Calcutta crisis started a kind of mode of urban planning which we started calling physical planning and regional planning. This was prevalent in the 1960s, but when the Calcutta program spectacularly failed in the 1970s, there was a lot of soul searching about how things should be planned. So if you look at the 1969 Kathmandu report as well, it just makes a plan in the abstract. The implementation and the financing of that plan is left for other agencies to handle. The internal deliberations of the Ford Foundation and World Bank after the Calcutta program spectacularly doesn't go anywhere, was that in future, planners should not suffer from God complex. They have this recognition that planning cannot be devoid of or removed from political realities, understanding of state capacity, financial questions, and what kind of implementable authorities you have. So you had a more practical turn in urban planning. At the same time, because Calcutta became this embodiment of a city on the verge of death, because it did not die, there was also this complacency. That, even if we don't plan, somehow it will be okay. Things will work out one way or the other. So the phrase was, cities can muddle through. And the other, in the new right, was, cities can be shaped by benign neglect and by market forces. So did I answer that question? Yeah, thanks. And the last one is, the lived experience, right?
From that time, the long 1950s.
From the long 1950s. So the term that I use when I think about Calcutta's reputation is hyper-reality. By hyper-reality, I mean that in terms of our subjective experience of cities, it is shaped by class, in India, caste, religion, so many factors, right? These are very subjective representations. So my mother, for example, used to visit Calcutta from Patan in the 1950s and 60s, and she would say it was fantastic. And I've heard many others say. Simultaneously, we are aware that there were people living on railway platforms, and in fact, they were living under railway platforms as well, right? Because there was so much homelessness, so much poverty, also because of refugee crisis, and clearly 30, 40, 50 years of sheer urban neglect in an economically very, very important city. So there were many realities to the city. What I try to do here is, and what I'm trying to understand is, how is it that one particular image of the city acquires dominance?
Right.
And I think here power plays a very big role. So I still think that if Khrushchev had not visited Calcutta in 1955, the city would not have acquired the kind of urgency in global imagination as it did. Those images were triggering at that time to a lot of people in multiple ways, which is where the contingency part also comes in.
Right. Thanks, Gaurav.
Thank you.
We'll take questions. I'll ask you first. Do you want to go one by one, or are you going to get 2 or 3 questions?
Whatever you prefer is
okay. So let's do 3 questions at a time, and I would like to request you to keep it rather short, with a short introduction of yourself. Thank you so much. Yes. Mike, thanks.
It was very interesting and very relevant to our situation to hear your speech. I'm not very much involved in urban planning or anything like that, but I have some very much quiz-type questions. My question is, it may sound very naive too. India moved its capital from Kolkata to New Delhi. Pakistan moved its capital from Rawalpindi to
Karachi.
Islamabad.
Karachi to Islamabad.
Yeah, Karachi to Islamabad. And USA moved it from New York to Washington DC several years ago, several decades ago. Were these measures helpful in alleviating the problems of several crises in these old cities?
Sure. Thank you. That's a very good question, actually. I'd love to answer that.
So as we wait for more questions, maybe want to take this one on?
I think this is really a very, very good question, and I've been thinking for some time of editing a volume on former capital cities. So Calcutta being one, Karachi being other. In Australia, it's Melbourne. In the US, it's actually Philadelphia. None of these cities actually have benefited from the movement of capital away from them, and that's true. At least in terms of importance, I think political importance does bring to city certain advantages. That said, the reason why I don't overemphasize that in my presentation and my work is that Calcutta was moved, the capital for Calcutta lost the capitalship of British India in 1911. But even after 1911, at that time the British businesses were actually a little happy. They were like, we will get more breathing room from the government. So for the next 50 years, it did not really see or did not really understand what were the consequences, or did not experience negative consequences of the government moving away as such. Those started to play out in different ways much later, which is why I don't overemphasize that point. But yes, no, it's a great question, and I hope to edit a volume soon on all the former capital cities of the world. Thank you.
It's actually, I really like it.
It's a really great question.
Yeah. Do we have, yes please, with a short introduction. Although you are kind of very public.
Okay, I'm Musa. For us, Kolkata means like education and trade and the politics. Our Communist Party started in Kolkata many years before, and Communist Party's members were looking a house in Kolkata where party was formed, right, in the beginning. And for a cyclist, and Kolkata is the one from where the 5 cycles came first time from Kolkata to Kathmandu, and that's the legacy for us. My curiosity when Kolkata comes and West Bengal comes, it goes to Charu Mazumdar and that struggle. I'm curious about after this all the presentation, World Bank and the Ford Foundation and all those economic intervention, how the CPM government responded when Jyoti Basu was chief minister, and for us, West Bengal, Kolkata is the capital of communist movement, right? Still, we feel in that way, but nowadays I think we are not in that illusion after Nepal's experience. But still, there is a hope, and CPM, and then TMC, and now Hindu fundamentalist BJP, right? So how the BJP's role will be the further work, but before TMC, so how you are going to quickly respond? It's not necessary, but
I'll respond very quickly. So we know, of course, the fear of communism was very important for this discourse, and I think the rise of communism was also partly because there were some material issues that were plaguing Calcutta as a city and West Bengal as a province. Then the state gets partitioned and goes from being India's biggest province to being India's smallest actually at that time. Right? So there are issues, and which brings it to rise. They first came to power in 1967 as part of a coalition, and it was very awkward for Ford Foundation to interact with them because the whole plan was designed to stop the coming of communists to power, right? But to their surprise, they actually found that initially, at least, they were actually quite keen to implement some of the plans that Ford made, or the planning group was making, especially what they call basti improvement, slum improvement. That was the initial part, but then there were other issues that happened with business groups which are right elsewhere, which shakes business confidence and so on and so forth. But this McNamara visit was actually a result of a conversation between Ford officials and the government of West Bengal at that time, which had communists. By the time McNamara comes to Calcutta, that government is dismissed. There's president rule. So by the time he comes in, the government is gone, and you see massive anti-Vietnam War protests as well. But to cut a long story short, I didn't see that much of a discomfort from World Bank or Ford Foundation in working with the communists, and they seem to be, at least in the files that I have read, they seem to be quite pragmatic in terms of what these people can bring to the table. So they were trying to adjust to the situations in which they were also operating, which in their own words was bourgeois democracy. So that's my short response to you. The longer response can be. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chandra Prajapati, architect and urban designer.
Oh, wow, okay.
My question is a follow-up question to the first question, because there has been several talks going on in Nepal also, like moving the capital from the Kathmandu Valley to somewhere else. What would be your thoughts in terms of the consequences, or let's say in terms of the opportunities it might bring?
Right. No, I think this is an important question. The good thing about being a historian is that we analyze things only once they are done. Right. The other great thing about historians is that we don't work with living people; we like dead people. So, and dead people don't talk back. We can do whatever. So there are certain advantages that I have which you don't have. So you have a more difficult task. However, I don't know about this. The record is mixed, right? So, for example, Egypt is now making this massive capital city close to Cairo, which seems to have drained the Egyptian economy. Myanmar made one, which has only roads and no people. I think there's one more example. Indonesia, I was going to say that, which also may or may not work. India has tried many satellite cities. In fact, the first satellite city in India was a city called Kalyani, which was built close to Calcutta, and no one has heard of it. I've never been there. So it's completely it didn't really work out at all. So I think the historian's response is that the future is unpredictable, and it is for the planners to future-proof it. That said, it seems to me that attempts that seek to just simply build a capital city in the middle of nowhere don't succeed. So the advantage of Islamabad was that it's actually a suburb of Rawalpindi. They're very, very close by. So I don't know if Kathmandu Valley's geography will allow for a similar kind of a closeness to existing centers. So that's my broad sense. So my answer is what most historians say, it's complicated. But of course, I think you have to see the closeness and see how that works. Historically, it's not been very good.
Hi, so my name is Sagar Wanta, and I'm the transportation engineer and the planner.
Oh, wow.
So my question is, when you talk about this in not investing enough in Kolkata's infrastructure as it grows, but the other side of the argument is, especially from the Western development sector, is there's too much of what development is. There's too much infrastructure being built, and I think there's also an argument of Vikas Bhaneko ke ho, like what is development? Because the definition of development in Nepal and everybody else is like highways and big buildings and all of that, which sort of goes against the lived experience or the settled, communities that are here. So in that sense, I think one of the arguments that some people have tried to make is the South Asia or the global South should define a new form of urban development where you're not too focused on like hyper urbanization or hyper infrastructure growth, but also try to understand the local indigenous settlements and how they are growing, and then define development that suits the cultural or historical perspective of a community, rather than saying build highways and that's where economy is, that's where growth is, versus what your experience you're saying is Calcutta is the other end of not investing at all. So I think from a, intellectual perspective or from a research perspective, where should that middle ground be, right, and where as we move forward?
Right.
That's
right. No, I think this is of course such an important question, which is why I said it's a knife edge, and I think there's always trial and error in trying to reach that sweet spot, and I don't know if cities ever manage to do so. But I think the issue is not only roads. Indian cities, for example, now building expressways and bridges everywhere. They're probably easier to build and they're more visible. I think what I mean by infrastructure is what is really lacking as well is the provision of basic civic services. Right? Water, garbage disposal, sewage. And there seems to be, at least in the 1990s, some sort of a planning idea that these things can be weaponized in order to direct urban growth and development in certain ways. I can sense that happening in India too, where not every locality has the same level of civic services, and there's no guarantee that certain civic services would be made available, and if they will be made available, at what time they would be taken away. So I think the challenge for South Asian cities here and in Indian cities as well right now, I think it's far more basic, right? I think the first thing that we need to do, which we don't do enough, is civic services. What I'm trying to understand is what is it that makes us focus on fancy expressways, fancy bridges, rather than those things? And if we are functioning electoral democracies, why is it that those kinds of investments, they seem to have a bigger emotional purchase than those kinds of investments? In India, what is famously said is that no election has ever been won or lost on issues of health, education, electricity. And we have been holding elections now for more than 70 years. So which is why I'm coming from that angle as well, that what is it that makes, as Sabine also asked, what is it that makes the agenda of the elites public interest? I want expressways. I drive my car. I like it. But it's not necessarily great because it comes at the cost of something else. But it seems to be incredibly popular across all classes. And I think that is what I'm trying to understand through utilitarian developmentalism. So I don't know if I really answered your question or not. I'll try. But I think future-oriented questions, I'm always hesitant because the future is infinitely unpredictable. No one predicted AI, no one predicted the coming of COVID, and the future changes very rapidly. So all of you who are in future-oriented tasks of thinking have a much harder job than I have. And I have so much respect for all the futurists.
Well, the transportation planner engineer's job is future-oriented.
Yeah, it's like...
So this is 6:30 on the dot. Unless there's a question, we're gonna. Oh, from Hassan, yes. Sorry.
Thank you, Gaurav. A really interesting presentation. Thank you. My question is from what Sabine asked, the last question, and maybe I got it wrong, but it seemed like you're making an argument saying that, you know, if the Russian gentleman was not moved, Calcutta would not have been the worst city. If that is the case, if that's the argument you're making, I was thinking, what does it mean for us? Like, I read and write about cities as well. What does it mean for us who are trying to disentangle our cities from the colonial gauge? Thank you.
Right. No, I think that's a very, very important question. I think that about all the time. It just shows how little power we have in shaping the reputations of our cities. How much, you know. So, for example, even now, Calcutta has a certain kind of an urban reputation within, like, India at least, right? It hasn't really. It's not how it was perceived in the 30s, 40s, 50s. The crisis narrative still shapes, crisis and anti-business kind of a image still shapes. So one of the points that I was trying to make here, which I didn't make explicitly enough because it seemed to be very disempowering, is that cities try to brand themselves in certain ways. City branding is a very big exercise, right? But I think for most cities of the global south, we have very little control even now in terms of how we will be seen. It will be a product of a combination of global, local, regional forces. But nevertheless, how we will be seen will determine or shape many things or many ways in which the city is develops, right? To use it very crudely. I mean, just to give the example of Kathmandu, in 1969, maybe some other vision, if Kathmandu was conceptualized differently and not as Shangri-La, which was the last home of mystery, and so on and so forth, they could have produced a very, very different plan, which had not emphasized saving, say, agricultural this thing, and they could have made planned settlements or, urban nucleus around the Kathmandu Valley. The city would have been different. So I think people in positions of power, how they perceive the world is really important, because that perception itself changes the very world that they act on, but not in the ways that they always imagine. So as one big bearded man from Europe in the 19th century said, we all make history, but not in the time and manner of our choosing. So I think that is what. So it's not a very hopeful message. So that's why I kept that out.
Okay. So let's take one more. This
Sure.
is the last one. Please introduce yourself.
Best friend, so I need to ask one question.
Me?
To him.
I'm Mona Lisa Moharjan. I work with Heritage. So this is not like a directly question regarding your presentation because I came a bit late. My memory of Calcutta is like yellow ambassador bus, like taxis, and this very beautiful ruins houses. Like they have amazing houses, and the newly opened metro. Like I was there like 15, 16 years ago. And like the cheap, that you can get very good food at a cheap price. Like my friend was telling me, like colleague was telling me, at 6 rupees you can get like great rice and fish, right? And there are like big stadium, cricket stadium next to Marriott and this kind of very fancy stuff. But at the next to the road, there was like a families living on the roadside pavement in the tent. That was their whole house, right? So, and there are like, if you go to the metro station, near to Howrah train station and this kind of thing, you can see different level of people, right? And if you go to different lane, I don't remember the name of the lane, like that road. It's so posh, it's roads, lights, and big buildings with like luxury apartment. And somewhere I feel like this doesn't match, You know, like somewhere it's so posh and thing, and then the food and sometimes it's cheaper, but still people are living in that poverty. You know, like it's so poor. So sometimes I feel like, how come this city exists like this?
Right.
So it's so strange for me.
No, I mean that's a very good question. It's which is the point that I'm trying to make, is that Calcutta's business and landed elites have been remarkably successful for over a century in protecting their interests. Right? The idea that, again, Adam Smith was the godfather of capitalism, was the first person to say that business prosperity actually is diametrically opposite or at odds with society's prosperity. You make supernormal profits at a time when this thing is gone. So they have been very, very good at that. That's one point. But I think what you are saying is at least in India, India is now one of the most unequal countries in the world, not only socially, which is our heritage, but also economically. And at least now in India, there is questions of redistributive politics don't seem to have much of a purchase. So the inequalities that you see in Calcutta, you probably see now sharper inequalities elsewhere. And in fact, the famed cheapness of food in Calcutta is often projected as a sign of its economic underdevelopment. Not as you know, that the city accommodates the poor, but the other way around is that, you know, you don't have, there's so much poverty that people are willing to eat and sell food at 6 rupees or 10 rupees. By the way, that metro is also a gift of Cold War politics. We got all our technical aid from the Soviets. And simultaneously, we got World Bank and the Americans to work on other plans. So the city is also a mishmash of a lot of international intervention mixed with local initiative, where the elites did their own things separately. So it's like every city, it's a mosaic, it's a palimpsest of very contradictory movements.
My first urban planning project that I took up for my master's was a little project on the metros of Calcutta as a legacy of British Raj that people continue to use to this day. And I feel horrible about it to this day because I wrote it in a manner that I can't.
No, we all make mistakes when we are young.
But do we? Yeah. So I'm just going to say that for those of you who need to leave, please do so. We'll continue to entertain some questions.
Yeah. I'm happy. I'm so grateful for your questions and for your interest.
So if you want to leave, please do. Yeah. But you're more than welcome to stay.
Yes, sir.
I'm Bimal. My areas of interest is education and political economic development. So having listened to you, actually just trying to think aloud, you have very well actually presented how business interest, landed elite interest, and even Cold War global power interest have been reflected in this urbanization process or ideology of urban development. So what I would like to hear from you is that may not be dominant. You have discussed about dominant actually ideologies and trends there. Are there any counter narratives or let us say counter proposals, so other than the dominant ones that might come from civilizational development perspective or maybe environmentalist or climate, okay, those people may not be from majority, but maybe with minority voices. Are there any counter narratives or aspirations coming from different sections of society about what should be that modality of urbanization? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very good and very difficult question. So if you're talking in the current, you know, about the current times, if you're talking about 2026, I think there's a strong group of environmentalists who are especially trying to protect the wetlands, which they call the city's kidneys. That's where the kidney thing was coming in. There are also heritage and conservation groups. One of them is actually led by a very famous novelist in English, Amit Chaudhary, who has been trying to protect some of the residential neighborhoods that were built in the 1940s and 50s by the Bhadralok, the educated upper caste elites. And what they have been arguing is that it can become like a tourist draw because it's architecturally very eclectic, and so on and so forth. So there are, of course, many other visions of the city, and I think you have pointed out correctly. I've only looked at the dominant ones. I've got carried away by the dominance of the dominant, but I actually wanted to understand how that becomes dominant. There's also an initiative right now to light up all the older, beautiful colonial structures in the city, so at night it can resemble like Paris. All of these visions seem to be, as Naveen would say, very elitist. At least most of it seems to be very elitist. But nevertheless, they are there. There are multiplicity of views. There are multiplicity of ideas. But of course, there are certain ideas that are more dominant than others, and I've focused on this. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Gaurav. This was
thank you. Thank
for
you.
sharing the amazing work that you do.
Thank you.
Long may this continue. For all the patience and excitement and curiosities and everything else. Thanks to the audience. So we'll call it a day.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your patience and for your questions. It really means a lot. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So next. This is, as they say in Nepal, Maya Kuchi. It's a token of love from Baha.